Hey, today we're going to be doing Module 4, Lesson 15, and today we're going to be moving away from the multiplication that we've been doing, like a third times a third, or doing models like this. So today we're starting something a little bit new, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to be combining decimals and fractions. And what I mean by that is that I know that if I were to see this fraction, I know that this fraction, I can call that 1/10. But remember, 1/10 is also the same thing as 0.1, like 1/10. Or I can also write that in word form, like 1/10, or sorry, that would be unit form, 1/10. So these are all the different ways that I can show 1/10. The beginning of the year, we've learned a lot about decimals and how to multiply those, add those, things like that. Today, we're going to be kind of combining what we know about fractions and what we know about decimals to help us with multiplying decimals and using fractions to help us out with that. So what I mean by this, I'm going to do an example problem here. Let's say I have 0.1 or 1/10 times 4 ones. So let's say I have this problem. What I can do to solve this problem, if I don't automatically know the answer in my head, is I can rewrite this 1/10 as a fraction. So make sure that we remember those decimal places because that's really going to help us out. So I'm going to remind us up here. So if I have 0.1, that would be a tenth. If I had that, that would be 100th. And that would be my 1,000th. So let's not forget about those decimal places because they are very, very important for me. Oh, there we go. Now what I need to do is I need to rewrite this as a fraction. So I know that 1/10, I could just rewrite that as 1/10 because I can remember that that says 1/10. And then I can multiply by 4. Because remember, right now what you're basically finding is just 1/10 of 4, or 1/10 times 4. And this is a problem that you definitely know how to solve by now. So if it helps you out, you can rewrite this 4 as 4/1. But if you know how to do it without putting in that invisible number, you can do that as well. And then I just have to go straight across to multiply. So I do 1 times 4, which equals 4. And then I'll do 10 times 1, which gives me 10. Now, something that's very important for this lesson is I don't want you to worry about simplifying. So we don't need to worry about simplifying for this lesson, because what's going to happen is that this answer right here, this fraction, is going to change back into a decimal, because if I started with decimals, I want my answer in decimals. So it's fine that if I started with decimals, I changed it to a fraction, got a fraction, but now I need to change it back into a decimal. So I want you to say this out loud to yourself. 4/10. If I have 4/10, then that means that I need to have a 4 in my tenths place. So to write this as a fraction, I would have 0 in my ones, and then a 4 in my tenths place. And that would be my final answer, because remember, I started as a fraction. Or sorry, I started as a decimal, so I'd have 4/10. And remember, this bottom number right here would tell me what unit I have. So since I have a 10 right here, then that means I have a tenth. But let's see what another problem could possibly look like. So let's say I had 0.01 times 4. So now instead of having 1/10, I now have that number in that next place value, and that is my hundredths. So now I have 1/100th. So remember, if I have 100th there, then that just means that my denominator is 100. So 0.01 and 1/100th are the same exact thing. And then I'm just going to multiply that by 4. And I'm going to put that as 4 over 1 to help you out. And now when I go to multiply this, again, I go straight across. I do 1 times 4, which gives me 4. And then 100 times 1, which gives me 100. Remember, we're not simplifying. Do not simplify past this. So now that I have my problem starting off with decimal, I changed it into a fraction, I need to end with decimal. So I'm going to say that out loud to myself, 4 hundredths. So if I have 4 hundredths, that means that in my hundredth spot, I need to have a 4. So I'm going to go 0 in my ones, 0 in my tenths, and a 4 in my hundredths. And that is my answer. So this number right here, this fraction, this 4 hundredths, is the same thing as this over here. The only difference is that this is a decimal, this is a fraction. This denominator tells me what unit it should be in. So if I have 100 here, that tells me that my answer should be a hundredth, and that is where my answer should be, what place value it should be in. So let's do one more with this example right here. So now instead of having 100th, I'm now going to have 1,000, so 0.001 times 4. And what I need to do now is I'm going to rewrite this as a fraction. So if I have 1 in my thousandth place, then that gives me 1,000th times 4. Remember, I technically always have that invisible number 1 under my whole numbers. And now I'm going to solve. So I have 1 times 4, which gives me 4, and then 1,000 times 1, which gives me 1,000. We're not simplifying, though. I'm going to say this to myself, 4 thousandths. And since my unit is thousands, that's the place value my 4 needs to be in. So I'm going to have 0 in my ones, 0 in my tenths, 0 in my hundredths, and a 4 in my thousandths. And that is my final answer. So this and this right here are the same exact answers. It's just that you have to show me the decimals to get the final correct answer for these problems. So let's move on to the next example. Now I'm going to leave these two things up as reminders for you. So I want you to try this one on your own. So this one is 0.1 or 1/10 times 2. So I have 1/10 times 2. Go ahead and try this one on your own. And what we're going to be doing is, if I have this as 0.1, that 1 is in my 10th spot. So I know that I could say this as 1/10. So I'm going to rewrite that as a fraction. So I have 1/10 times 2, and I'm going to put that invisible 1 just to help me out. And then, because that's a whole number, so I can't put the 1 there. And then I'm going to do 1/10 times 2 over 1. So I have 1 times 2, which gives me 2. And then 10 times 1, which gives me 10. And now my answer is 2/10. Remember, we're not simplifying. I have 2/10. And when I do 2/10, I know that my place value is going to be 10, because I have that tenths. And then what number is going to go in that place value? Well, I'm going to have a 2 in that tenths place. So it's going to be 0 in my ones and a 2 in my tenths. So 2/10 is my final answer. Remember, these and this are the same exact answer, just different ways of showing it. All right, so let's move on to the last one for problem 1. And this one is 0.01 or 100th times 6. So for this one, I have 1 in my hundredths place. So I'm going to rewrite that as a fraction as 1/100th. And then I'm going to multiply that by 6. And technically, since that 6 is a whole number, it has an invisible 1 underneath it. So I'm going to write it like this. So now I have 1 times 6, which gives me 6 over 100 times 1, which gives me 100. Remember, we're not simplifying. I now have my answer of 6/100ths. And if my answer is 6/100ths, then that tells me that my answer needs to be in the hundredths place. And what number needs to be in the hundredths place? My 6 needs to be in my hundredths place. So I'm going to have 0 in my ones, 0 in my tenths, and a 6 in my hundredths. And then that is my final answer, 6 hundredths. All right, now we're going to move on to multiplying a decimal by a decimal. And in this case, we're technically multiplying fractions by fractions. So let me give you an example for this one. So we're going to do 0.1 or 1/10 times 1/10. And I'm showing that as decimals to start off with, but I'm going to change them into fractions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this 1/10 into a fraction. So I have 1 over 10 times 0.1 or 1/10, so 1 over 10. And now this should be a really easy problem for you to multiply because I just have to go straight across. So I do 1 times 1, which gives me 1 in my numerator, and then 10 times 10, which is 100. And then I get my answer of 1/100th, and I now need to just rewrite that as a decimal. So if I have 1 in my hundredth space, that tells me that I need a 0 in my ones, a 0 in my tenths, and a 1 in my hundredth space. And that right there is your final answer. So I'm going to have you guys try this next one on your own. So this next one, we have 2 tenths times 1/10. Remember, your first step is going to be to write these as fractions, then multiply, then change it back into a decimal. So go ahead and try this on your own. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this 2 tenths as 2 over 10. Remember, it's 2 tenths because this 2 is in my tenths place. Make sure you have your place value charts out on your desk so you can see them. So we have 2 in my tenths, so it's going to be 2 tenths times 1/10. This one is in the tenths place as well. So I'm going to be multiplying by 1/10. Then I just need to go straight across. I do 2 times 1, which gives me 2, and then 10 times 10, which gives me 100. Now, after I get to this part, I'm not going to simplify. I'm just going to write this back as a decimal. So if I have 2 hundredths, that means that my answer needs to be in the hundredths place. So I know that I'm going to have a 0 in my ones, a 0 in my tenths, but I want that 2 in my hundredth space. And that is my final answer, 2 hundredths or 0.02. All right, and remember, if you have any questions up to this point, please make sure you let me know. So for our next problem, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be doing something a little bit different, and that is going to be, we're going to have 1.2 times 0.1. Now, this problem is going to work just like all the other problems. I'm going to start with decimals, change them to fractions, multiply, and then turn it back into a decimal. But we're now working with numbers that might trip you up a bit. So I know that 0.1 is going to become 1/10. We've been using that for a bit now, so I know that that's going to be 1/10. But what about this right here? I have 1 and 2 tenths. So I guess I could write it as a mixed number, but that would be a lot of work if I wrote it like that. So another way that I could write it is I can decompose those units. I know it's been a while since we said that. But what I could do is I can decompose these units. So instead of seeing it as 1 and 2 tenths, I can see it as 12 tenths. So we kind of pretend that that decimal is not there. And I think about, okay, well, what number does that look like? Well, that looks like 12. And what decimal place is that last number in? It's in the tenths place. So then that will give me 12 tenths. And I write 12 tenths like this. So I write 12 over 10. So that's 12 tenths. Yes, it's an improper fraction, but that is okay for it to be an improper fraction. And what I need to do now is just what I've been doing as always. I just multiply straight across to get my answer. So I'm going to do 12 times 1, which gives me 12. And then I'm going to do 10 times 10, which gives me 100. So I have 12 over 100. But remember, you're not simplifying. I'm just going to say this out loud to myself that my answer is 12 hundredths. So that tells me that my answer needs to be in the hundredths place. But remember, it's this last digit that needs to be in that hundredths place. So when I do this, I'm going to kind of work backwards now from what I've been doing. I know that this 2 needs to be in my hundredths place. But since my answer is 12, I need to have that 1 then in my tenths place. I have a 2 in my hundredths. I now have a 1 in my tenths, which means that I now need to put a decimal, and then I'll put that 0 in my ones place. So 12 hundredths, you would just write that as 0.12. That 2 needs to be in your hundredths place. And that would be the final answer to this problem. So all I did is I decomposed this, and you should remember how to do that from earlier this year. And then I just write that as an improper fraction, multiply. I get this number, I get my fraction as my answer, and then I just have to rewrite it as a decimal. All right, let's move on to the next set of problems. So for this next set of problems, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to have 0.1 times 0.01. And so my answers might look a little bit different, but still the same thing that we've been doing. So I know that 0.1 or 1/10 can be written as 1 over 10 as a fraction. But now I have 1/100th because that 1 is in the hundredths space. So then I'm going to write that as 1 over 100. And this is where it's important that you remember how to multiply your powers of 10. So now I'm going to multiply straight across. So I do 1 times 1, which is 1, and then 10 times 100, which will give me 1,000. So remember, I just do 1 times 1, which gives me 1, and then I have those 3 zeros that I tack on. So I have 1,000th. But remember, I'm not done when I have that fraction. I need to rewrite it as a decimal because I started with decimals. So if I have 1,000, that tells me that that 1 needs to be in my thousandths place. So I need to have a 1 in the thousandths place, a 0 in the hundredths, a 0 in the tenths, a decimal, and then a 0 in the ones. And that is your final answer for this problem. All right, I'm going to have you try this next one on your own. So for this next one, we have 0.5 or 5/10 times 1/100th. So we have 5/10 times 1/100th. Try this problem now, make them fractions, get your answer, then make it into a decimal. So for this problem, you should have 5/10, like so, because this 5 is in the tenths place, so I'll rewrite it as 5/10. Then I'm going to multiply it by 1/100th, because that 1 is in the hundredths space. And then after that, I'm going to do 5 times 1, which gives me 5, and then 10 times 10, which I know gives me 1,000. After I get this, remember I'm not done just yet, and I'm not going to be simplifying. I have 5,000ths as my answer, so that tells me that I have a 5 in my thousandths place, a 0 in my hundredths. I know there's a 0 because there's nothing else over here. 0 in my hundredths, a 0 in my tenths, a decimal, and then a 0 in my ones. And that is my final answer. And then let's try the last one of part 3. And this is another one that might be a little bit tricky, so you can work along with me if you would like. Or you can try this on your own. So for this one, we have 1.5 or we'll talk about that. And then we have 0.01 or 100th. So I already know how to write this as a fraction. That's easy for me. That is 1/100th. We've been doing that a lot. But this 1.5 over here is a little bit more difficult. So I could write it as 1 5/10. So I could write it as a mixed number, but that's a lot of extra work. What I can do instead is I can just decompose this. So I'm going to think about that decimal's not there. What number is that? That is 15. So I know I'm going to have 15 something. So I'm going to have 15 over what? Well, what place value is that 5 in? That 5 is in my tenths place. So right now I have 15 tenths. And it's fine for this number to be in improper fraction. That is okay. So now what I need to do is I need to multiply 15 tenths times 1/100th. So I'm going to do 15 times 1, which gives me 15. And then I'll do 10 times 100, which gives me 1,000. And this is where it might get a little bit tricky for you to remember how to rewrite this as a decimal. Because remember, we're not done just yet, and we're not simplifying. So if I have 15 thousandths, that means that my answer needs to be in the thousandths place value. And remember, this last digit is the one that's going to be going into the thousandths place. So I'm going to have a 5 in my thousandths. And then this 1 also needs to come along, but this 1 will then be in the next place value over. So I had my thousandths. Now I have my hundredths. So I need to put that 1 in my hundredths. And there's no other number, so now I just have to fill in the rest of the place values with 0. So my tenths should be a 0. I have my decimal point then, and then I have a 0 in my ones. So then this is what my final answer looks like, 15 hundredths. Or thousandths, sorry, 15 thousandths. All right. Go ahead and erase this, and then we're going to work on our last set of numbers. So for this last set of numbers, I would like you to try these on your own, then we'll come together and see how you did. So we're going to start off with 7 times 0.2. Let's see what you can do with this one. So this one's got to think a little bit. All right, so for this problem, you're going to be starting with 7 times. So we don't have any fractions here. This is just a whole number. If you would like to, you can write it with that invisible number underneath it. But there's 2 tenths right now because I have a 2 in my tenth spot. I'm going to rewrite that as 2 over 10. And now what I'm going to get is 7 times 2, which gives me 14 over 10, because 1 times 10 is 10. So I'm going to run into a kind of problem here, and you might think, okay, well, I know that I need to change this improper fraction into a mixed number. And normally, that's how I would ask you to solve these problems. But since we're relating these back to decimals, and I want my answer in decimals, I don't have to do as much work. I just have to think to myself, well, what does 14 tenths look like? And I know that if I have 14 tenths, then that 4 needs to be in what place value? Well, it needs to be in my tenths. So my tenths, I'll write a 4 in my tenths, and I know I need a decimal. And then what number is left over? Because that's only 4 tenths. I still have that 1. So I'll write it like this. So I have 1 and 4 tenths, or 14 tenths. And that is my final answer for this problem. All right, let's move on to the next one. This one might actually be a little bit easier. So now we have 0.7 times 0.2. And what I need to do for this one is I need to rewrite these as fractions and then come back eventually to decimals again. So go ahead and try this one. We'll see how you do. All right, so I have 7 tenths times 2 tenths, and I know that these are 7 tenths and 2 tenths because they have that digit in that tenths place value. And now I'm going to multiply straight across. So I do 7 times 2, which gives me 14. And then I do 10 times 10, which gives me 100. So now I have 14 hundredths, and I know then that my answer has to start in that hundredths place. So that hundredths place right there. So I know that my 4 needs to be my hundredths place because my last digit always needs to be in that place value. And then if my 4 is in my hundredths place, I need to move over to the next place value then. So that's my tenths place. So my 1 needs to be in my tenths place. And then I'll put a decimal and a 0 in my ones place value. So my final answer is 14 hundredths. All right, we're on to our very last problem. I want you to try this one on your own, please. And we'll see how you do. So for this one, we now have 0.07 times 0.2. So we have 7 hundredths times 2 tenths. So go ahead and try to solve this one. All right, so for this problem, We have 7 over 100 times, or 700 times 2 tenths. I know that this is 700ths because the 7 is in my hundredths place value. And now I'm going to go ahead and multiply. So 7 times 2, which gives me 14, all over 100 times 10, which would give me 1,000. So right now my answer is 14 thousandths. So I need to rewrite that now as a decimal. So if I have 14 thousandths, that means that this thousandths place needs to be filled in with this 14 right here. So this last digit, this 4, needs to be in my thousandths place. Then I move over to the next place value. That's my hundredths. That's where this 1 is going to go. So I have 1 in my hundredths. And now I just need to fill in the rest of the place values with zeros. So this tenth needs to be filled with 0. I need to have my decimal. And then I'll have a 0 on my ones. And my final answer is 14 thousandths. So I would suggest that if you're having a hard time with this lesson and remembering where your place values are at, I would suggest going back to previous lessons, maybe on Zern or on Khan Academy, and looking at your place value chart, just so we can get a reminder of how to do decimals, because it's going to be really helpful for today's homework and problem sets. Now for your problem set, you're going to be doing number 1, B through D. So I'll bring this up a little bit. Number 1, B through D, and then number 2, A through I. So you have a lot of problems today. And then for your homework, you're also going to be doing number 1, B through D, and then number 2, A through I. Now for number 1, B through D, for both the problem set and homework set, they're going to have these really large models, and they're cut up into like hundredths. And they want you to use these models to help you solve these problems. I am not going to make you use those models. So you're going to see a lot of them, but you do not have to use them. So you can skip that and you can just do the math just like the way that we have been learning how to do it. You do not have to do the models. If you'd like to, cross out the models, but please, please, please do not do the models. All right, and go ahead and get started, and good luck.